Dr. Melville, welcome to the inquiry. Let me explain the setup. The audience in front of you consists of a mixture of participants, largely infected and affected core participants. Those to the left of you are lawyers who represent various different interests in the inquiry, and at the back there may be a representative of the press. But beyond this room, those who will hear what you have to say and watch it are those in a breakout room here, those who are watching on YouTube or on live stream. That audience in total will be in three figures somewhere. In a moment or two, Mary will invite you to take the oath, and then after that, Mr. Hill will ask you the questions. Mary.
Please state your full name.
Colin Randolph Melville.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence that I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Yes.
Professor Melville, is it right that you are the Director of Education and Standards at the General Medical Council?
Yes, it is.
And you've been in that post since January 2017?
Correct.
We'll come on in a second to talk about what your responsibilities are. But before we do, is it also right that you are a medical doctor?
It is.
And could we have a brief overview of your career up until the point that you took on your current role, please?
Yes, of course. May I just start by expressing our sincere acknowledgements of the things that have happened to folk and our part as a GMC in wishing to learn and how we take that forward. I studied medicine at Sheffield University and qualified in 1983. I did various medical jobs ending up in the specialty of anaesthesia. I became a consultant in 1996 and worked in Hull, where I remained taking on additional responsibilities as a medical director for an ambulance service, the director of medical education, something called the Foundation School Director, which came in 2005, and then the interim undergraduate dean at Hull York Medical School. I moved from there to Warwick University in 2012 as the head of medical education and a graduate entry medical school, and from 2015 in April to Lancaster Medical School, where I was the head of a department in the Faculty of Health and Medicine. I then left there not long after I started, I suppose, in January 2017 to take up my current post. At the time I took up my current post, I ceased to take part in clinical practice because I felt that it was important to give my time to this role. But I remain on the register as a licensed doctor.
Thank you. I would like to begin by looking at what the GMC is very briefly, and I'll do so by reference to the written statement of Charles Massey, who is the Chief Executive and Registrar of the GMC. And this is a statement he provided to the inquiry. We could have it on screen, please, Lawrence. It's WITN 3365001. If we go down to paragraph 4, we can see under the title, Our Role, what Mr. Massey said was this. The General Medical Council, GMC, is an independent organisation that helps to protect patients and improve medical education and practice across the UK. A, we decide which doctors are qualified to work here, and we oversee UK medical education and training. B, we set the standards that doctors need to follow and make sure that they continue to meet these standards throughout their careers. And C, we take action to prevent a doctor from putting the safety of patients or the public's confidence in doctors at risk. So those are the three broad roles of the GMC. And is it right that your position, your post, involves you in the first two of those? Yes,
that's correct.
The statement from Mr. Massey is on the website, and people can refer to it if they wish to know more about the structures of the GMC. But with you, Professor Melville, we're going to concentrate on those first two aspects, the medical education, training and standards. Could you explain then for us, please, what your role as Director of Education and Standards involves?
Yeah, so I act as the director for two broad groups of people, those involved in education and those involved in standards. The standards team are responsible for creating the professional guidance, the key document of which is called Good Medical Practice, and that applies to all those who are on the register. Because obviously medical students become doctors, we also have an affiliated guidance called Achieving Good Medical Practice, which helps medical students to understand what the professional duties of a doctor are. That guidance was last produced in 2013 and is currently being revised. We recently conducted a consultation from which we had over 4,600 responses, including from patient groups and I think what are often called hard-to-reach groups. We wanted to make sure we heard from as many people as possible. That analysis is currently in play, and we expect to produce the revised guidance probably in Q2 of next year, and that always has a 6-month lead time. So it's published, and then 6 months later it's implemented. That allows both the profession and those involved in education and training to familiarise themselves with it and adapt whatever educational processes they need to meet it. The other part is education. It is slightly more complicated for historical reasons. So we oversee all stages of medical education. So that includes medical students and postgraduate training. Where it's a little bit complicated is because of history. Our basic functions include the first year of being a doctor, what used to be called, and relevant to the period of the inquiry, the pre-registration house officer, but is now part of a 2-year foundation program. The documents that relate to that is our key document, last updated and published in 2019, and that's called Outcomes for Graduates. For postgraduate education, which includes everything beyond F2, those are overseen by the colleges, the Royal Colleges, so the medical Royal Colleges for each specialty, and they are responsible for developing a curriculum, and we approve that. And the guidance document that helps us to understand what they're doing is called Excellence by Design, and that sets out the processes for postgraduate curricula. The foundation period, this bit which includes the F1, the former PRHO, and the F2 period now, isn't a college specialty. And so a group called the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges, which is a joint group of all of the presidents of Royal Colleges, produces the curriculum for that and oversees its production. Again, we approve that curriculum. The delivery of those curricula in terms of postgraduate training rests with the education bodies of the 4 nations. So each nation has its own. So Health Education England, NHS Education for Scotland, Health Education and Improvement Wales, and the Northern Ireland Medical and Dental Training Agencies. So I'm only saying that because they all have slightly different titles, as you'll see. But they are responsible for overseeing the delivery and commissioning the placements in which postgraduate doctors are trained, and we approve the placements in which that training happens. So there's very much a collaboration between ourselves as the regulator, the colleges and the medical schools in terms of delivery, and the education bodies in overseeing it. I hope that's helped.
It is. Thank you very much. I would also direct people to paragraph 5.1 of your statement, which helps to explain that further as well. You say there that you set overarching requirements for providers of undergraduate medical education, so before Foundation Year 1 and Foundation Year 2, and the outcomes medical students must achieve in order to graduate and be granted provisional registration with the GMC. We do not set or approve the content within undergraduate curricula for medical students. This responsibility sits with individual medical schools. Could you just explain that distinction between what it is that the GMC does and what it is that you leave to the medical schools?
Yes, so it's a complexity of regulation. So the higher education institutions or universities, they are regulated by a different body. But because medicine leads to registration with the General Medical Council in the UK, we set what the outcomes are, so what must be achieved, but not the precision of the content or the sequence in which it's delivered. That belongs to medical schools. We do quality assure it, so we are involved in a process that makes sure that they are delivering to meet the outcomes, but the actual way in which those curricula are developed, and I was part of that when I was head of a medical school, is with the individual medical school, and there will be an internal process of quality management from the university and also an inspection from the Quality Assurance Agency, the QAA.
Now, having worn both of those hats in your career, are you comfortable with the way that that balance is struck?
Yes, in broad terms. I mean, some might argue it would be simpler to have it all in one place, but the counterpoise to that is, well, where do you draw the line? There are a number of healthcare professions that used university courses as part of their process, so it would then make it messy in a different direction. So I think it's more about how well we work together, and we work, I would say, very well together between the GMC and the individual medical schools, and with their council, which is called the Medical Schools Council. So each dean of each medical school is part of the Medical Schools Council, and I also have an observer role in their meetings.
When you say it is how you work with one another, the GMC can direct the outcomes, but is there also a more informal channel of communication as to the way in which the GMC would seek to influence the content of the curriculum?
Yes, absolutely. So when so for example, when we renewed the outcomes in 2019, we consider backwards, if you like, what is the current status of the workforce? What are the requirements of being a doctor? And to some extent, are those priorities reflected in the way that the outcomes are written and how medical schools deliver them? So one of the things we emphasised in the rewrite was more on understanding populations, particularly index of deprivation, for example, more on understanding health promotion, more on primary care and general practice. So we tried to give some stronger priority to areas where it's important that doctors in general have greater understanding.
Do you find the medical schools receptive to the GMC's influence in that way?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I mean, in fact, when we published that, it wasn't for implementation for several years. Because of the timeline it takes 4, 5 or 6 years for a medical student to come through that process. But in fact, we found medical schools had already adapted their curricula in many cases within just a couple of years. So in other words, they welcomed, I would say, those changes, and that was very helpful in them steering the way that their curricula are being developed.
Do you obtain feedback from recent students or current students at medical schools as to their experiences and whether they are being taught enough to meet the outcomes that the GMC expect of them?
Yes, we do. I mean, we used to have a process where each medical school produced an annual return. We've changed it very slightly to try and, if you like, create more ownership by the medical school of the information they're providing to us. And then we look at the information they've provided, and we use other survey material and other information we have from other sources to say, does this all make sense? Does this add up to one story? So I suppose we call it triangulation of the evidence. But when we do visit, and we visit particularly schools that are, if you like, coming on stream, so there are a number of universities at the moment who are not yet on the list of producing doctors, if I can use that word, but are developing, and we actually go and talk to their students. And if we are involved in any meetings, and this applies with junior training doctors as well, we will ask their opinions as well.
Will that feedback include specific comment on, for example, what they're being taught of the duty of candour?
Not on every occasion. So one of the difficulties we have is there's an enormous number of questions you ask. So what we seek to do is to try and sample from the range of things that we are, if you like, concerned about, and make sure we are. So we have asked previously specifically about the question of duty of candour, because actually together with the Nursing and Midwifery Council, we produced some guidance on a professional duty of candour, and we've embedded it again within the outcomes for graduates as something that should be being taught in medical schools.
We'll come to look at that in a second. I've been asked to ask you whether or not there is any general sense that you get from the feedback about how the duty of candour is being taught in medical schools.
So I think I would look more at how it plays out in real life. So you can teach something, but it doesn't mean that you actually will implement. And I think we are across a whole range of things seeing a cultural change that now, as we see students becoming junior doctors going through their training, there is a much better understanding and also willingness to engage with openness and honesty, the candour for patients. So meeting our professional duty.
Finally, on this point, is there a system in place to alert the GMC to shortcomings in any particular institution, the way that matters are being taught?
So we have our annual reporting system, which the medical schools will provide for us, but we also have eyes and ears. So actually anyone can report a concern, and if we do hear concerns about the way in which education is being delivered, whether that comes from a member of faculty, an outside person, a patient, or even a medical student, we do consider it and we do act on it, and that may involve follow-up questions with the medical school if necessary.
How do you make, for example, a first-year undergraduate aware of the fact that they can complain about or raise concerns about their medical school?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So we have the outcomes for outcomes for graduates. We also have the Achieving Good Medical Practice, and that also references good medical practice in the importance of raising concerns when they arise. We have a part of the GMC which we loosely call the outreach team, which are actually they do go round and visit both medical schools and hospitals and training settings, and that gives them the opportunity to actually hear directly from students, and that is built into a more centralised process within the GMC, where we bring all those threads together and say, what do we make of this? Do we need to take any action or not?
Let's turn to some of the documents that you've referenced there. We could begin with outcomes for graduates. And if we could have on screen, please, WITN 7248004. As you have told us earlier, and as you've said in your statement, this is a document which sets out what newly qualified doctors must know and be able to do. If we could turn, please, to page 10 of that. We can see that outcome 1 is professional values and behaviours, so a broad title. But then if we could see a diagram showing the different elements within that, professional and ethical responsibilities, legal responsibilities, patient safety and quality improvement, dealing with complexity and uncertainty, safeguarding vulnerable patients, and leadership and team working. And if we go on to the next page, please, page 11 electronically. The first of those, professional and ethical responsibilities, the document states this: newly qualified doctors must behave according to ethical and professional principles. They must be able to demonstrate the clinical responsibilities and role of the doctor. B, demonstrate compassionate professional behaviour and their professional responsibilities in making sure the fundamental needs of patients are addressed. There are a number of other elements. I'm not going to read through them all, but if we could go down to J, please, the second half of the page. Recognise the potential impact of their attitudes, values, beliefs, perceptions, and personal biases, which may be unconscious, on individuals and groups, and identify personal strategies to address this. K, demonstrate the principles of person-centred care and include patients, and where appropriate, their relatives, carers, or other advocates in decisions about their healthcare needs. L, explain and demonstrate the importance of subparagraph seeking patient consent or the consent of a person who has parental responsibility in the case of children and young people, or seeking the views of those with lasting power of attorney or independent mental capacity advocates if appropriate. B, providing information about options for investigations, treatment and care in a way that enables patients to make decisions about their own care. And C, assessing the mental capacity of a patient to make a particular decision, including when the lack of capacity is temporary, and knowing when and how to take action. And then 2 points below that, N, be open and honest in their interactions with patients, colleagues and employers when things go wrong, known as their professional duty of candour. And then if we just go over to the page, I'll just raise one more of this list at point P. Explain and demonstrate the importance of professional development and lifelong learning, and demonstrate commitment to this. If we just pause there, then we have within that first subcategory of professional values and behaviour a number of elements of the professional and ethical responsibilities that you would expect to be taught and a newly qualified doctor to possess, and those include responsibilities in respect of patient consent, duty of candour, lifelong learning, and recognising bias. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And as we discussed earlier, those are the outcomes that the GMC set. How the curriculum is designed to meet those outcomes is left to the medical school.
Yes.
If we look at the next document then, the generic professionals capabilities framework, we could have on screen please WITN 7248005. I'm just going to read the introductory section of this because I think it helps to explain further what this document does. We have page 3, please. The introduction says there are 66 medical specialities and 32 subspecialities in the UK. For postgraduate medical training, each discipline has its own distinct curriculum set by the medical college or faculties, which we approve. There is significant variability of core professional content across many of these postgraduate curricula. Our fitness to practice data shows that most concerns about doctors' performance fall into one or more of the 9 domains identified in this generic professional capabilities framework. And several high-profile patient safety inquiries have identified major deficits in these basic areas of professional practice. Reports from these inquiries recommend the importance of and need for specific training to address individual team and organisational deficiencies, as well as addressing their wider systemic failures. And if we could just go down to the bottom of the page, the final paragraph there says, the generic professional capabilities framework gives a detailed description of the interdependent essential capabilities that underpin professional medical practice in the UK and are therefore a fundamental and integral part of all postgraduate training programmes. So should we take it from this, that this document and the material it contains is intended to cover across all of those different curricula that are in place for postgraduate training to embed the standards that GMC consider to be important?
Yes, I mean, I think you highlight from your reading there, this emerged from some work that was done on fitness to practice. And when it was looked at the then postgraduate curricula, these were not strong elements in all curricula, and it was felt that it was really important that we set that out. So since this document was published, which actually was published in May 2017, so this was my first publication outing, if you like, we have now almost completed a review of every postgraduate curriculum, and we require that the generic professional capabilities are embedded within every postgraduate curriculum. So we now have it embedded in undergraduate curricula, foundation curricula, and all postgraduate curricula.
If we could just look at the domains on page 2. we will see, I didn't go through the entirety of the outcomes for graduates, but we see, again, a Domain 1, professional values and behaviours, Domain 2, professional skills, Domain 3, professional knowledge, and so forth. These are, again, echoing the same types of outcome as they were described in the previous document, here described as domains, but to embed the same set of values in this phase of the education of a doctor.
Yeah, to be fair, this was published before the most recent outcomes. So in fact, this is the other way around. This informed how we updated the outcomes for graduates.
Is then the intention to provide a journey through your medical education and into your professional career in which these values are embedded and reiterated again and again?
Yes. Some talk about the helical learning process. You should revisit things and develop your depth and breadth of understanding of them.
Is that a philosophy that the GMC has consciously adopted in terms of?
It's a well described for those in the know. Sorry, it's a well published, well described approach to building education, that you don't just teach it and forget it and go on to something else. You actually revisit things so that people can learn in greater detail, and you're building on the foundations each time.
Have you found those who are setting the postgraduate's curricula to be receptive to the approach that the GMC are taking?
Yes, absolutely. It's probably worth saying one other thing about these, if I may. In each of those domains, there are a number of bullets. Some people think that that's an exhaustive list. They were always meant to be illustrative examples. So they're not a tick box list of things you have to do. They're examples of how you would evidence in that domain.
So let's have a look at some of those. If we turn, please, to page 8. Domain 1, professional values and behaviours. And if we go down to the third point here, treating patients as individuals, respecting their dignity and ensuring patient confidentiality. The next one, taking prompt action where there is an issue with the safety or quality of patient care, raising and escalating concerns where necessary. And then the next one, demonstrating openness and honesty in their interactions with patients and employers, known as the professional duty of candour. So we can see carried across from the, or vice versa, carried into the outcomes for graduates, those same ideas and same values. But if we just expand the screen for a moment, please, Lawrence. Could you just expand on the point that you have just made? That this isn't just a set of tick boxes. How would you expect the curricula to develop these ideas?
Yeah, so the bullets listed on that page are examples of how you would demonstrate professional values and behaviours. But life changes, and as things are learned, you realise actually that isn't an exhaustive list. There could be other examples. I don't think anyone has ever argued with any of these, I should say, so it's not as if there's something in here that shouldn't be, but there may be things that we learn as we go collectively that would be added to that as a further example. The way that they're built into curricula depends to some extent on how the existing curriculum is structured. So are we still with undergraduate or postgraduate?
If you could,
in the general.
we're looking at postgraduate here, but if you could speak more generally as well, that would be helpful.
Yeah, so when medical schools look at their curriculum, they will look at our high-level outcomes, and that will become the end point. I often use the example of it's a little bit like a car sat-nav. You have to put in a destination in order to get a route. So the outcomes of the destination, the route you choose may be quite varied, but it has a common end point. And along the way, they would think about, okay, so how will we include teaching on professional values and behaviours, which may be something like a taught session. It could be a lecture plenary on medical law, for example. Or it could be a case example, or if they're talking about a patient story, so what are the ethical issues that this particular case raises? So there are lots of different ways of doing it, and rather than just sort of saying, right, in week 3 of term 2, we're going to do the whole of ethics and then never visit again I think that then runs the risk that it doesn't become embedded. So hence the point about these are threaded through and you build up the understanding of them so that by the time you graduate, you will have a quite wide understanding of all of these factors.
I've been asked to ask you in this context whether or not curricula, either at undergraduate or postgraduate, contain lectures or modules on previous safety incidents, such as the matters that this inquiry is concerned with.
So I can't give you a specific answer, but I can say that I am aware of cases being used because they are a very helpful way of learning. I was trying to think if I could think off the top of my head for an example from my own background, but I do know that cases are used in this way because they're very helpful in understanding issues, and they also illustrate the difference between perhaps how things were and how things are now and what has changed.
But that is not something that the GMC would impose. That would be a matter for the individual medical provider to decide upon.
Yes.
Now, before we leave this particular screen, may I just ask you a point of detail about what's said there? If you look down, I think it's the 5th bullet point, it is demonstrating openness and honesty in their interactions with patients and employers, known as the professional duty of candour. I think it's in this self-same document that there's a slightly different definition of professional duty of candour because the words after employers are added where things go wrong. This is wider, I think. Is it? Is it meant to be?
So I don't think the professional duty of candour is restricted to when things go wrong. So
well, that's what I would have thought.
You may have picked up the deliberate mistake. So I would be really grateful to know where that is because actually we will take a look at it.
There was reference to it just a few moments ago. I meant it may not be in this document. I may have got that wrong, but
I think it may be the title of the document which is provided jointly.
No, it's the definition. It's actually definition. No, the professional duty of candour. And we came to it earlier. But we can find it and come back to it.
Well, for clarity, so may I just say that the professional duty of candour does not only apply when things go wrong. The professional duty of candour applies, full stop.
Thank you.
And I'm sure that's what everyone in this room and everyone else would expect.
Well, that's why I was asking the question.
Yes, no, we will pick that up. Thank you very much.
We'll come on to the document that the GMC has produced with the Nursing and Midwifery Council in due course. Just so that we are clear, this document, this list that I've given here, or the 3 examples that I've given here, there are many others within this document, some of which reflect on similar matters that these 3 contain. So, for example, if we go to page 14, under the heading Clinical Skills, there is more detail given on consent. And it says, underneath the heading of consent, doctors in training must demonstrate and understand the professional requirements and legal processes associated with consent, including making sure patients are accurately identified, considering and addressing mental capacity issues, and then getting informed consent from the patient or other valid authority before carrying out any examination, investigation, or treatment. And then if we just look at a few other examples of what this document contains, if we go back to page 9, please. The 4th bullet point from the bottom, maintaining their continual professional development and completing relevant statutory and mandatory training. Then page 11, please. Under the heading Communication and Interpersonal Skills. Sharing decision-making by informing the patient, prioritising the patient's wishes, and respecting the patient's concerns and expectations. And then a little further down, the penultimate bullet point on this page, delivering an honest apology and offering an effective explanation where appropriate. And then the bullet point, the footnote there, the star, is to the document which is jointly produced with the Nursing and Midwifery Council, openness and honesty when things go wrong, the professional duty of candour. So that's the title of the document, but as you've just said, it's not just about when things go wrong.
May I add one
Yes,
point
please.
of clarification? So I think in all of those examples you've just given, this is from a document. This document was published in 2017, and in the footnote on an earlier page, it does actually say the consent guidance is being updated. And I just wanted to pick up one phrase.
Yes.
It talks about informing the patient. So our latest guidance does not talk about informing the patient. It talks about having a conversation with a patient so that you understand what matters to them. So we've nuanced the language slightly to reflect the fact that we need to be, as doctors, much more engaged with the patient's perspective rather than the doctor's decision. So I think that this is due to be updated, but we haven't agreed a timeline for it. But I think it's quite important just to make that subtle difference. This document predates, and therefore the consent guidance is the more up-to-date text.
I think if we go back a page, we actually see that. It's back to page 14. In the footnote.
Yes.
And it's the footnote there, making decisions, patients and doctors making decisions together. That's the concept, is it?
Yes. So it's much more about not the doctor deciding, but the doctor providing the information so that the patient may make a decision.
And therefore not the doctor, as it were, consenting, in the old-fashioned phrase, the patient, because it isn't a process for the doctor to go through. It's a joint decision as to which route to take to the destination.
Indeed, and the title of that document is called Decision Making and Consent. So it's trying to say people, I think a lot of my colleagues in the profession, we understand the colloquial use of the word consent. What we're trying to do is to shift the conversation to say it's about how you make a decision, not about I make the decision and you tick the box.
And is this perhaps an example of how, as time passes and standards change, matters that even 6 years ago were written down in a new document need to be reviewed and changed in due course?
I mean, that's, the good medical practice was last printed, if you like, in 2013. So we've come through to 2022 and it will be updated next year. So that iterative process of learning from how societal values change, how our expectations change, and how our legal, ethical, moral duties are evolving are reflected then accurately in the guidance that we provide.
Just for completeness, if we could go please to page 17 of this document. Under the heading or domain 3, professional knowledge. We have professional requirements, and those include, the first of the bullet points, meeting standards expected of all doctors set out in good medical practice, the document that you've mentioned and we'll come on to in a second. Keeping up to date with GMC guidance, and then 3 or 4 bullet points below that. Participating in reflective annual appraisal. Below that, recognising the need for all doctors to take part in revalidation. These are all concepts that we will come on to in a second. And then at the bottom, participating in continuing professional development to keep their knowledge, skills and capabilities up to date. So these are the values and the standards that you would expect doctors to be learning in their postgraduate training, but also reflected in the outcomes document for undergraduates as well.
Yes.
And then finally, page 21. Patient safety includes raise safety concerns appropriately through clinical governance systems. And 5, 6 bullet points from the bottom. Understand fixation error, unconscious and cognitive bias, a point that we will come back to later. Thank you, Lawrence. We can take that document down. In your statement, you mention a new assessment which is being introduced in 2024 to 2025, which is the medical licensing assessment. Could you tell us what that is and the purpose of it, please?
Yes. So at the moment, across the UK, each university determines how it will construct the final examinations leading to graduation, which is the award of the degree. And in the legislation as written, if you are awarded the medical degree and you have no outstanding fitness to practice concerns, you will be automatically granted registration with the GMC. What the MLA is doing is bringing together a common threshold standard for all UK medical schools. So if you like, the scope of the test and its content will be determined at a national level rather than by institution. And it's split into two parts, which is a written part, which we call the Applied Knowledge Test, or abbreviated to AKT, and a clinical component, which is called the CPSA, the Clinical Professional Standards Assessment. Sorry, you end up using abbreviations all the time, you forget their meaning, don't you? Because of the diversity and the way that clinical exams are set in universities, and without going into lots of small technical details, we've set a list of requirements that have to be met by individual universities, but the actual test is set by individual universities. The Applied Knowledge Test is being coordinated on behalf of all UK medical schools by the Medical Schools Council, which I've referred to earlier, and they are constructing the test in a way that meets our requirements for them. So there's a set of requirements for CPSA, a set of requirements for AKT, and those both have to be met for us to approve that the MLA is compliant with our requirements in regulation.
So every would-be doctor will have to pass this, will it cover aspects such as the duty of candour?
So every exam, and I think that's true of any exam that any of us have sat, cannot possibly cover every single item in a curriculum, and it has to be sampled. But it remains the possibility that all of the things we're talking about this afternoon, whether it's duty of candour, consent, teamwork, leadership, all of those could be included in the assessment somewhere. And therefore it's the responsibility, of course, of students to prepare on that assumption.
Why was it felt necessary to introduce this new assessment?
I think it was a way of, for us, it was a way of saying, what is the minimum threshold? We have quite a number of new medical schools coming into existence, and I think we're in a very privileged position that UK medical education is highly regarded internationally, and collectively we wanted to preserve that reputation. And one of the ways of doing that was to bring it together. Even in the processes that have been conducted so far, many medical schools have already started to adjust some of their approaches to assessment anyway. So these are all good things. And in fact, I was part of something called the Medical Schools Assessment Alliance when I was in the medical schools prior to the GMC. And we were already working on sharing good quality questions, for example. Multiple choice questions are notorious for being quite difficult to write in a fair and descriptive way. And by pooling together the resources of 33 medical schools, rather than each doing their own, it allowed us to create a good quality question bank. And that became, or that has become, part of the basis of what will be the MLA's AKT.
Leaving education now and moving on to the development of a doctor through his or her career, if we could begin with looking at good medical practice, and we could have on screen, please, Lawrence, WITN 7248009. This is the document that you have referred to on several occasions, and the one that was last updated in 2013, I think you said.
Yes.
Could you just explain what the status of the guidance contained in this document is?
I mean, in a way, it is what it says on the front. So what we've sought to do is to say, what would your colleagues, what would members of the public expect in terms of professional standards? So this is not about the clinical content, not about your ability to do X or Y or Z procedure in terms of the detail of that, but what are the professional standards? What behaviours do we expect? How do you go about the work that you do? How do you build relationships with other people, including working in multidisciplinary teams? And they become the standard, if you like, for good medical practice. That's the important thing. A long way back, we used to have it constructed the other way up, something that got called the Blue Book, which was, here is the list of things that if you do, we might take action against you. And that was felt to be very negatively framed. And this is why this has emerged. Inevitably, again, things and society changes. And we've looked at some of the areas that we believe might need a stronger focus, which includes things like clinical leadership, teamwork. And we went out to consultation on that basis to say, you know, whoever you are, if you like, whether you're a professional, an organisation, member of the public, patient body, does this sit comfortably with you in terms of the standards that we would reasonably expect doctors to meet?
Let's look at a couple of examples from good medical practice to see how it's worded and structured. And bearing in mind, as you've said, this is from 2013 and is due for update. If we could have, please, page 18. Under the heading Establish and Maintain Partnerships with Patients, paragraph 49, you must work in partnership with patients, sharing with them information they will need to make decisions about their care, including their condition, its likely progression and the options for treatment, including associated risks and uncertainties. B, the progress of their care and your role and responsibilities in the team. C, who is responsible for each aspect of patient care and how information is shared within teams and among those who will be providing the care. D, over the page, any other information patients need if they are asked to agree to be involved in teaching or research. If we go back, please, Lawrence, just to the stem of paragraph 49, the words "you must" are used. Can you explain what the significance is of those words in this document?
Yes, so I think you'll find right at the front of the document we actually do define what we mean by "you must" and "you should." But essentially, the "you must" statements are things that we believe should be consistently applied by all doctors at all times.
Perhaps we'll look at that then. Page 7, please. "You must" is used for an overriding duty or principle, and "you should" is used when we are providing an explanation of how you will meet the overriding duty. How are doctors held to account for following or not following good medical practice?
So firstly, it's your individual responsibility to be aware of the document and the professional standards expected. So there should be a degree of self-reflection in that process. We would expect employers, and that will vary on the nature of the employer status, to be involved in identifying where standards may not be being met. And if there was serious concern, then we have a process that involves responsible officers. So each employer will have a responsible officer who will be responsible for, we're going to come on to it later, aren't we, the revalidation process. So it might be better to come back to it then. But essentially, if they were felt to be so far removed from the standard, then a patient, member of the public, doctor, employer could refer that to the GMC under our fitness to practice investigation, which, as I've said, is not my prime responsibility. But there is no bar to any individual raising a concern with us if they feel that a doctor is not maintaining those standards.
And if the disciplinary process is implemented by the GMC, will this document, Good Medical Practice, be one that is used as a yardstick against which that doctor's conduct is judged.
Yes, I think if you read any of the tribunal transcripts, you will find specific reference to the relevant paragraphs of good medical practice when tribunals are considering their decisions.
If we could just look at a couple of other examples from good medical practice. Page 20, please. Domain 4, maintaining trust, paragraph 55. You must be open and honest with patients if things go wrong. If a patient under your care has suffered harm or distress, you should A, put matters right, if that is possible, B, offer an apology, and C, explain fully and promptly what has happened, the likely short-term and long-term effects. Could you just explain to us there the difference between you must be open and honest and then you should, with the examples of what has just been, of what is written there?
So going back to the page 7, I think it
Yes.
was. So the you should is explaining how you're going to meet the openness and honesty. So to meet the open and honesty, you should put matters right if that's possible. You should offer an apology. You should explain fully and promptly what's happened and the short-term and long-term effects. It's helping to explain what we mean by saying you must be open and honest.
And then if we could go, please, to page 8. Knowledge, skills and performance. At paragraph 8 we have, you must keep your professional knowledge and skills up to date. 9, you must regularly take part in activities that maintain and develop your competence and performance. And then at 11, you must be familiar with guidelines and developments that affect your work. Now, in addition to this core document of good medical practice, firstly, I should say, these are phrased very broadly, but is that because they are intended to apply to every single doctor in the country?
Oh, well, actually, it's every doctor who's on our register. So if you hold a UK licence, irrespective of which country you are in, you should be following good medical practice. You may also have to follow other nations' guidance too, but if you're on our register, this is the standard. So it's not just about those in the UK. I should say, of course, that you cannot practice medicine in the UK without being on our register.
I've been asked to ask you this, but in your statement, paragraph 11.1, you say that good medical practice, and I quote, also takes account of the diverse approaches to the duty of candour across the UK. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Yes, so that is simply that each nation has some of its own legislative powers, and whilst we can set a professional duty of candour which is at a professional level, some nations may produce their own nation guidance. So Scotland has some guidance on duty of candour. Northern Ireland is debating, well, or rather not at the moment because it doesn't have an assembly, of course, but would be debating whether it has a statutory legal duty of candour. So what we're seeking to do in this guidance is this is UK guidance for any doctor on our register working in any UK country, but it has to take account of variation in the law in the 4 different nations, which is not always the same.
In addition to this core document of good medical practice, is it right that the GMC also provides specific guidance on specific aspects, such as confidentiality and the duty of candour?
Yes, so good medical practice, if you like, is the high-level summary advice which applies to all doctors. And then below that, we have a series of more detailed documents that we call explanatory guidance. So the guidance on confidentiality and on decision-making and consent are 2 examples where you can see the thread of consent is in good medical practice. A much greater detail of it sits within that second document. And in fact, I can see quite clearly that from 2013 to when we updated our decision-making consent guidance, you can see a nuance in the phrasing that we've already, so the explanatory guidance appears to be inconsistent. That will become corrected when good medical practice is updated.
If we could have a look at one of the examples of that, WITN 7248013. This is for guidance produced jointly with the Nursing and Midwifery Council and the GMC. Openness and honesty when things go wrong, the professional duty of candour. I'm not going to go through it all. These documents are all available online,
Yes.
as well as being attached to your statement. But if we just look at that first box on the left-hand side, it says the professional duty of candour, and then it explains the core principle of the professional duty of candour. And then paragraph 4 on the right-hand side, in line with what you've just said, it says this guidance gives more information about how to follow the principles set out in good medical practice and the equivalent document for nurses and midwives.
You see there the number 2, the when things go wrong.
I do. Well, you wouldn't have seen me, but I just sort of wry smile to self. We need to look at that.
Do you know when this document was published? I'm not sure I've got a date on it, but I can help you.
I think it's either 2018 or 19. I'm surprised it's not dated, actually. Most of our documents are dated, so that's rather odd.
I wasn't able to find a date
Okay.
earlier, but again, this constant process of reviewing and renewing guidance will come through on it. If we could just have a look at some of the...
It does say on the back updated June 2019 and
thank you very
updated
much.
February 2022. It was originally published in 2015. I was thinking about the update, but I will pick up the point that Chair has mentioned that appears to imply that it's only when things go wrong.
How easy is it to update this type of material? I know that's a very broad question, but is it a case of simply going onto a master file and changing a couple of words and sending it back out, or is there a more involved process than that?
It depends on the nature of the change. So we have made some amendments to good medical practice where we felt that the amendment wasn't substantially changing the text. I would need to discuss this with my standards team and just think about, are we misleading? Is this misleading people by implying that the duty of candour only applies when things go wrong? Because I doubt that's what I think it's the contextual thing that illustrates that it's even more important when things go wrong, that you need to be open and honest. But the principle of openness and honesty applies to everything that you do.
If we could look, please, at the second page of this guidance. I think this helps to provide a little more context to what is contained in the guidance. It said, the guidance is divided into 2 parts. A, your duty to be open and honest with patients in your care or those close to them if something goes wrong. This includes advice on apologising, paragraphs 7 to 22. And B, your duty to be open and honest with your organisation and to encourage a learning culture by reporting adverse incidents that lead to harm, as well as near misses. Both of those seem to imply that it's more about when things go wrong rather than a wider responsibility. Is that fair?
I suppose so. I was just trying to sort of reflect in my own mind. If you talk about openness and honesty, that applies in the generality. There is something in my mind that says we seem to link candour with when something goes wrong, but I'm not saying that candour equals openness and honesty. So I think it's not a deliberate intent in any way to mislead. I think the guidance came about because of trying to illustrate the importance of how you address things when it goes wrong. That was the focus. But I don't think we would then say that candour only applies in that situation. You should be open and honest about everything that you do, as we say in good medical practice. And I've read this document previously and I hadn't picked up that nuance. So I think it is something that we will definitely look at. As I've said, I think I said in my opening remarks, I think we're all here to learn, and if there's something we need to do to act on that, we will. slightly more complicated because this is a joint document with another organisation, so we will need to work with them. But I see no reason in principle. It may be to do with how the guidance is phrased. It may be better to say what to do when something goes wrong and actually move away from talking about duty of candour. But I think in the guidance as I recall it from Scotland, and certainly in discussions around guidance, or rather statutory legal duty in Northern Ireland, the essence of candour is often constructed around when things go wrong rather than openness and honesty, which is at all times.
I'm not going to go through the rest of this document, but do you have any way within the GMC of seeing how often this document or similar guidance is being referred to, is being picked up by medical practitioners?
So the only way we can look at that would be to see how many times the web page on which it is situated is opened, or whether the document is downloaded. If it's helpful to the inquirer, I'm sure we can provide that information.
But do you undertake any kind of survey work to see how widely this document is known amongst medical practitioners?
So we monitor quite a lot of our web interface activity. Of course, what I don't know is who's downloading it.
Yes.
I don't know if this is a doctor working in a hospital, or it could be the education dean of a medical school who will be then using it to develop teaching. So it's a little bit harder to know. But I would say that culturally we have come a long way in terms of openness, honesty, reflection. The fact that we've now got appraisal, for example, for all doctors, I think is an important step forward, and that has been driven largely by the introduction of revalidation and a much more, if you like, mandatory requirement to do appraisal and reflect on your work and your relationships and incidents, whether they be compliments or complaints.
Let's turn to that now. If you could just explain to us what those different elements are. Firstly, appraisal, then revalidation, and a little later we'll come on to continued professional development.
Okay. So appraisal is an annual process that, annual in the sense of, broadly speaking, annual, where all doctors undergo a meeting as the appraisee with someone who is an appraiser, and that person will have been trained to conduct an appraisal. So it is framed around the 4 domains of good medical practice that we've already discussed. It also includes the doctor providing evidence of what they have done to meet the requirements of those 4 domains, which is where it links to the CPD point. It also has to have evidence from a human resource department that says no one has raised any complaints or about this individual doctor. The doctor may themselves include any compliments that they've received. They need, on a 5-yearly basis, I'll explain that comes under revalidation, to have gained what we call a 360 feedback from professional colleagues, and that isn't just doctors, by the way, at all tiers of organisation, and also from patient feedback or client feedback. Not everyone is involved in direct patient care, so some other evidence that gives you some insight into who you are and how you have been. And that should lead to a conversation between the appraisee and the appraiser. And that likely should be including elements of reflective practice. I think there's a guidance that we haven't probably submitted to you called the Reflective Practitioner, which actually was a joint guidance that we did together between ourselves, the GMC, with the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges for postgraduate, with the Medical Schools Council for undergraduate, and a group called COPMed, the Conference of Postgraduate Medical Education Deans, who work for the national education body. So it was a real joint effort that covers the whole of training from medical student through to completion of postgraduate training, guidance on becoming more reflective as a practitioner. Many, well, I don't say many, all students now who come through undergraduate training will have been I'm going to say taught how to be reflective, and it's that process that feeds into the appraisal. The cycle of appraisal runs over a 5-yearly period, and that appraisal process belongs to the employers. Those appraisals are then contributed together to the responsible officer, who is a senior doctor within an organisation, and at the end of a cycle they will make a recommendation to the GMC, which is called the revalidation recommendation, and that is what grants you the licence to practice. So you're on the register as a doctor, but you have to have a licence to practice in order to be involved in clinical care of patients. The other bit that's missing is the CPD, yes. So continual professional development. For each specialty, as we alluded to before, there are 66 specialties and 32 subspecialties. I think that's also out of date now, by the way, because 103 is the number I have in my head. And each specialty will produce advice on what it believes as the evidence that will support the appraisal process. And they will recognise internal, so within the organisation, and external, hosted elsewhere, educational events that covers relevant content to your particular sphere of practice. They issue it as a number of points, but we don't require them, as evidence against those domains within good medical practice. That's quite complicated. I don't know if I've explained that very well.
To see if I have understood it, and
okay.
This may have nothing to do with the quality of your explanation, but my understanding. But to see that I have understood it, a doctor will be expected to undertake continuing professional development, and as
yes.
the name suggests, that will be as and when, but on a regular basis.
Yes.
Annually, they will have to submit an appraisal to an appraiser, and then every 5 years, those appraisals will be considered by a responsible officer for the process of revalidation, and if they are not revalidated, they will not have a licence to practice. Is that right?
I think your summary is far more eloquent than my explanation. No, that's absolutely right. So you can either be not licensed or you can be deferred. So it doesn't mean that you're kind of one strike and you're out in terms of practice. It means that there are some missing elements or something else needs to be done. If that content becomes available, then the revalidation decision will be reviewed.
Who takes on the role of appraiser?
So each employer and the RO will approve and be responsible overseeing the training of appraisers. They will often be your colleagues. So I was an appraiser in one of my organisations. I'm not now, but I'm a responsible officer instead for the GMC. When appraisal first came in, which off the top of my head was probably around 2004-05, it was almost voluntary. But the process of the introduction of revalidation drove that change to make it, if you like, mandatory as a condition of the licence to practice. And I think that, in my view, has been a really helpful development. I should say that not all doctors agree with me.
What is the area of disagreement? This is just burdensome and...
Yes, basically. Some people think it's not changing anything. It doesn't address the concerns that people have, and frankly we've got far more important things to do. What I think is interesting is this cultural kind of change. I can't prove this to you, but because of what I said about the nature of how medical studies are now taught and that sense of self-reflection, the cultural changes about openness, team working with colleagues, I think there is a better understanding. I hesitate to say, but some of those who are at my end of the career never had that in their educational background and therefore perhaps don't see it in the same way.
Is time made available to both appraisers and responsible officers away from their clinical duties to undertake these tasks?
So I can't answer that. That would be a question which we'd need to explore with individual employers, but it is something that I know some individual doctors say they don't have time for these things.
Is one of the problems which has to be faced with any appraisal system that the person who appraises cannot be junior to the person appraised for obvious reasons, and therefore must be equal or senior, which may impose ultimately, as you're looking at the top of the tree, who appraises the top?
So two points perhaps to make on that. I understand the principle of seniority, but it's actually, for me, it's about being trained to be an appraiser, not about trained to be being more senior as a doctor. And not all appraisers have to be more senior than the person they're appraising. Otherwise, we're creating a, if you like, an ageist architecture. It's a different
I was suggesting
process.
peer appraisal on an equal level, but the issue was the question of people who are seen to be of a lower standing in the profession.
So I don't think that's an issue, but mostly we're talking about people who are already consultants or GPs. So in one sense, they're all level.
Yes.
But then you've got the hierarchy of seniority of time in off, time in post, I think. There was a second part to your
yes,
question.
it's the question of if you're looking at the senior.
Oh, yes. So I am the responsible officer for the GMC, and as it happens, I am only responsible for the revalidation of 2 doctors. But as a responsible officer, I also have to have a responsible officer, which is called a higher level responsible officer, and perhaps slightly perversely because I work for the GMC, but if you ignore that for a moment, the higher level responsible officer appoints an appraiser who will be someone in another organisation with whom I have my appraisal. And the higher level responsible officer will make, you can see the problem now, make a recommendation to the GMC, albeit another directorate department, about whether I should be revalidated. And the higher level responsible officer in turn has another responsible. So eventually you reach a top where there are 2 people who are broadly equal.
Yes.
You did ask.
How does the GMC go about monitoring how effective individual responsible officers or individual appraisers are?
So it's in a kind of tiered process. Clearly, the number of organisations, I mean, for example, there are 300,000 doctors on the register, so it would be impractical in the current structure for us to be able to have close understanding of every single doctor. So the way we do it is through delegation. We have a group of people called the Employer Liaison Advisors who work with every responsible officer across the UK, depending on which organisation they work for, whether that's within the health service or the independent sector. And they divide it up into regions and countries, and will have meetings and updates designed for responsible officers. Each organisation has a responsible officer. In some cases, it's also the medical director, sometimes called the chief medical officer of that organisation, and sometimes it's separate. We don't make a requirement for that in revalidation terms. They will be responsible and accountable for A, making fair and good decisions, and B, making sure that all the appraisers are trained. All of us as responsible officers have to submit an annual report that says how many of our doctors have been appraised, how many revalidation recommendations we're making, and whether doctors who have not been appraised have a legitimate reason for not having had an appraisal. So there's a process through the higher level ROs where that for each individual organisation is checked. So our role in a sense is to act on the recommendation of the revalidation decision of a responsible officer, but not to manage the process within the organisation. So the responsible officer regulations, which are different in each of the 4 countries, is not legislation that belongs to the GMC, it's separate legislation.
But their actions are governed by legislation, and there will be consequences if they fail to live up to.
Yes. And the revalidation is part of our legislation.
I've been asked how it is that the GMC identifies whether or checks whether or not doctors are maintaining continued professional development. Is that done through this scheme of appraisal and revalidation?
Yes, so whilst we don't mandate specific CPD, the colleges for each of their specialties will recommend a range of appropriate activities that contribute to CPD, and the appraiser will consider that as part of the appraisal. So if there is insufficient, inadequate evidence of CPD, then that appraisal may be deferred.
So I note the time. I think I've probably got about 15 minutes worth of questioning left. I'm also conscious of the need to have questions from call participants and the needs of the stenographers as well. So I'm in your hands as to how you'd like to proceed.
Well, let me just ask Dr. Melville. We can go on for a quarter of an hour now and then take a break for half an hour. We can otherwise take a break for half an hour now, come back, 15 minutes questions, further break, and then, of however long it takes for questions to be fielded for council to ask. Which would you prefer?
Well, I have no idea of the time because there's no clock visible.
Well, I can tell you it's 3:15.
Okay. I really don't mind, however you would prefer.
Well, let's proceed, shall we, and see if we can do it in 15 minutes.
Turning to a point raised at paragraph 10 of your statement, and I'll take it briefly. GMC is concerned with doctors. It is not concerned with non-clinical senior leaders. Has it ever been suggested that the GMC should take on some kind of role to provide the guidance on candour and consent and similar themes to non-clinical leaders?
Lots of things have been suggested about what the GMC should take on, but it falls from the legislation. So if the legislation were written to require it, then we would comply with that. So whilst it's not true that we don't have powers in that area, we do work with trust boards in order to try and help them become aware of what the issues are. And as it happens, next week I'm going to speak to the senior clinical leaders of a trust, having already had a meeting with their trust board to try and help them understand what our areas of concern are. So whilst on the one hand we have no powers, on the other we do seek to work to help trust boards understand what their roles and responsibilities are in respect of doctors. And I know my colleagues in outreach also interface with non-clinical leaders, but it's influence rather than power.
Do you know if there are any other organisations who are providing guidance, training and such like for non-clinical leaders?
I think that the Faculty of Medical Leadership and Management has explored how it can contribute in that area, but I'm not aware personally of any other organisation that's directly involved, but I am sure there will be some.
And I've been asked to ask you this. Do you think that it could be beneficial if non-clinical senior leaders were subject to the same kind of appropriately adjusted appraisal and revalidation process?
So I guess my answer to that is, as a GMC employee and completely separate from the fact that I am a doctor and a registrant, all of the GMC undergo an annual appraisal, and I think it probably marks out a good organisation anyway. I don't know whether NHS organisations do something similar. I'm not privy to that information.
Can I turn to the question of implicit and explicit bias? And I'll do this by referring to your statement. If we could have on screen, please, Lawrence, WITN 7248001. Paragraph 13.1 at page 14. What you wrote is this: recognising and accounting for bias is an important issue for doctors. And I pause there to note that it was covered in some of those documents that we've looked at, and we didn't go through that exhaustively. We have prioritised this as part of our work on generic professional capabilities and now require bias to be covered in all medical training as part of behaviours that affect patient safety. 13.2. In the generic professional capabilities framework, we define cognitive and unconscious bias and fixation error, an error which occurs when the practitioners concentrate solely upon a single aspect of a case to the detriment of other more relevant aspects of the case, and how these may impact on patient care. We encourage doctors to take a human factors approach to understanding the complex factors which influence behaviour at work in a way that can affect patient safety. Human factors approaches aim to reduce error bias through better understanding of how systems and processes affects human behaviour and culture, and applying this knowledge to clinical practice and clinical settings. I've been asked to ask you to expand upon what that human factors approach is, and perhaps to give a practical example of how it might work.
So I'm not a human factors expert, but I have been doing some work with the Royal College of Surgeons who are doing so. So maybe I can give you an example which was shared with us, which is to consider the pilot of a glider who is a pilot glider instructor. He's in the cockpit on his own. He takes off from the south coast over the English Channel and thinks, this is not a safe place to be, I'll go back overland. Imagine the scenario where you put 2 glider pilot instructors in a glider that takes off from the south coast and goes over the English Channel. The pilot who's actually flying the glider sits there and thinks, well, the person sat behind me is an instructor, and he hasn't said that we're foolish to be over the English Channel, so it must be okay. And the passenger, another instructor, is sitting there thinking, well, the chap in front who's flying the glider is an instructor, and he's obviously not bothered, so it must be okay. Now, you think this is kind of just an apocryphal story, but you don't have to go far to look on Google to a glider that crashed into the English Channel with 2 glider pilot instructors on board. It's that thinking, or that's part of the thinking that says, actually, if you think something's not going right, you should talk about it and not assume that somebody else is going to make it. And the other part of it is how you design systems for safety. So probably the best example is actually drug packaging labeling. And I think anyone who follows social media will see that many drugs appear to be similarly labelled, even if they're a completely different class of drug, and that can lead to mistakes. So the question is, how do you design a system, and I don't think that's been answered yet, by the way, but how do you design a system that helps to design out that risk of error so that the person who's involved in caring for the patient doesn't become the final arbiter of whether it's safe or not safe?
On a related issue within this theme of biases, does the GMC expect education on bias to include listening to female voices, particularly in relation to their symptoms and when they're experiencing pain?
Yes, I imagine this comes in part out of the menopause, and I think we've still a way to go. So we've listed 3 biases, but I think the list of biases has got longer as people have started to unpick what that's about. And for me, this is an example of how our collective social understanding and cultural context helps us to think about how we deal with these things, making assumptions based on historical sets of values, which we can now look back and say are clearly unreasonable or unfair. It depends on us collectively working. So I think we talk about implicit and explicit, but I think other people talk about conscious and unconscious. So a conscious bias would be where I knowingly and deliberately am biased for or against someone. Unconscious would be where I don't intend to be biased, but it happens that I am. And in both those cases, I think it's how we work together. So in my senior leadership meetings, for example, at the end of them, we have a period of reflection, which is there to say, how did we manage that process? Did anyone say anything that could be misunderstood or misconstrued? So we're trying to learn from each other. And I think that is also a process that we need to be much more accepting, that just because someone, we used to say pain is what the patient says it is. But your point is, unless they're a woman, in which case we think it's different. That kind of bias is something that we're working, and I don't think we haven't eliminated it, and in fact I'm not sure on an individual level a bias can be eliminated. It's about being aware of it to try and minimize its impact, but also being open to understand that if someone challenges you on it, you're willing to reflect and say, actually, yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it in that way. And I think that's about, again, it's about the openness to learn.
Moving finally then to some general concerns which have been raised with me and with the inquiry generally. Put bluntly by one of the core participants in a question, what can be done by the GMC to change entrenched attitudes and old-fashioned crustiness?
I like that. Well, I mean, I don't like it, but I mean, it's an interesting phrase, isn't it? Entrenched crustiness. These things often take a while. I think the culture from the period that I think the inquiry is referencing, in sort of 70s, 80s, 90s, I don't think that's generally the culture that exists now. And I think, you know, looking at some of the way in which our own documents and guidance has evolved, and the expectations we have around behaviours have changed, illustrates a willingness to change. A lot of this is going to depend upon individuals being willing to raise concerns. I think we referenced that earlier, in order to challenge those kinds of behaviours. And I accept that is not always easy. Power gradients make that often very difficult. So we know, for example, we do an annual training survey where we ask both doctors in training and their supervisors to answer questions. And we have examples where bullying behaviour has been found in some departments in the past 4 years. We didn't survey in the year of the peak of the pandemic, but in 2018, 2019 and 2021, some departments appear in all three. So it is clear that there are still what we might describe as entrenched behaviours which are not appropriate. And in fact, I recently asked my team to say, can we have a look at where those departments are, and let's think about how we get involved in them. I'm really pleased to say that at the recent Human Factors conference I was at, I talked about something which we call, which we're working with, which is called the Professional Behaviours and Patient Safety Programme, which is delivered by our outreach team. And I was contacted shortly afterwards by one of the lead doctors in a northwest part of England saying, how can we roll this out to our departments? And I think there is a willingness to engage, but people are needing some help in how they deal with these things. So not easy, but by no means are we relaxed about it.
On a related theme, the inquiry has heard specific evidence about concerns that NICE guidelines aren't being followed in respect of tranexamic acid. And we provided you with the transcripts of Professor Roberts and Professor Murphy on this point. Firstly, not necessarily specific to tranexamic acid, but is it a phenomenon that you recognise of NICE guidelines not being followed on a fairly wide scale in the country?
I don't think so. I think here you're asking, does the GMC know, and do I have a personal opinion?
Yes.
I don't think on either that you use the phrase on a wide scale. I don't feel I can answer that, but it's certainly, I'm not hearing anecdotal evidence that would support the idea that it's on a wide scale. NICE, of course, update their guidance, as probably we know. And again, it would fall back to, in the first instance, the guidance and the employer relationship. So the employer should be working to use its human factors system guidance to say, how should tranexamic acid be deployed? I think I outlined at the beginning, our responsibility is not about clinical guidelines, so it's right that that sits with NICE. If there was a serious concern, or someone felt that it was a serious concern, then they would have the right, as we've said before, to raise that either through the complaints process with the employer or indeed with ourselves. It would depend on the facts, what action, if any, we took at that point.
What levers does the GMC have if it were to become aware of the fact that an area of guidance isn't being followed?
So we wouldn't be responsible for the implementation of guidance in the general. We would be more focused if someone raised a concern about a particular doctor in that context. However, if we were hearing that sort of thing, we have contacts within NICE and within the other regulators, including in England CQC, and we have channels where we can share information so that we're aware collectively of where there may be concerns, because very often what we find is concerns in one area may be reflected by concerns in another.
Two final questions. The first is about continuing professional development and the need to appraise yourself of the latest practice. To what extent does CPD impose an obligation on a doctor to keep himself or herself up to date? And tied to that, is there anything more that can be done in the CPD process to ensure that they do keep themselves up to date?
So obviously the colleges and specialties will produce their own guidance to bring their colleagues up to date. The evidence that you bring to appraisal will include evidence from CPD and should include, in broad terms, the question, what have you done in the past year to keep up to date? Can you give examples? That's the sort of question that I would reasonably expect to be coming up. The individual doctor has their own responsibilities to do that. There is, of course, in any 1 year, going back to my question about exams and sampling, it's not going to be possible to show every year evidence for everything, and therefore you would expect to see different evidence offered in different years at appraisal.
And the final question that I have for you before we break and hear whether or not CPDs have others. We heard from Dame June Rain yesterday, and one of the points she made was specifically on reporting of adverse incidents and yellow card reporting. And what she said was, and I quote, "We've not quite cracked making it a systemic role of a health professional, which it truly needs to be." Could I ask for your reflections on what she said there, both from a GMC perspective and your own personal experiences?
So clearly, her point is right, isn't it? In that, in order to understand the risks, particularly around devices and medications, if errors aren't reported or insufficiently reported, we may not recognise something that's serious. So that comes back to the openness, honesty, engaging with the employer, engaging with the system to report concerns. It's quite difficult to see. You can make it mandatory, but how would you know whether someone is or isn't reporting? So the spirit of what she says is absolutely right. And I guess this is about encouraging people to engage in it. Many new medications do have attached to them what you should report, what they're particularly interested in hearing about. And it is a work in progress, inevitably.
So those are the questions I have for now. I'm sure that core participants will have some to suggest for me over the break.
Yes. Well, we'll take a break until not before 4 o'clock. The reason for expressing it in that way is that core participants have a right, through their legal representatives, to put questions to counsel to ask you arising from your statement or evidence generally. Since they won't have heard all that you won't have formulated the questions before having heard all that you've had to say, they must be given that opportunity.
Sure.
And that will take place within the next half hour. But it's otherwise an opportunity to have our afternoon cup of tea. But not before 4 o'clock. If it's any later, you'll be told. I can't tell you how long you'll be detained after 4.